The bags were still sitting on the table, unopened, when someone took her life. For 47 years, the man who did it walked the same county roads, breathed the same Pennsylvania air, and lived among people who never once suspected him. Then a scientist traced his bloodline across 4 centuries and an ocean, all the way to a forgotten village in southern Italy, and everything collapsed around him. This is the story of Lindy Sue Bashler. 19 years old, newly married, gone in a single evening, and the investigation that refused to close even when every lead had turned to dust. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe now, because every case we tell deserves to be heard. To understand what happened on December 5, 1975, you first need to understand where it happened and what that world looked like. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania sits roughly 2 hours west of Philadelphia, and in 1975 it occupied a peculiar middle space between 2 different Americas. On one side, rolling Amish farmland, horse-drawn buggies, tobacco fields, and a pace of life that felt deliberately removed from everything happening in the wider world. On the other side, small apartment complexes, young working families, the modest ambitions of people just starting out. It was the kind of place where neighbors shared recipes across the hallway, and nobody thought twice about leaving a door unlocked. America itself was raw that year. The Vietnam War had just ended in humiliation. The image of the last helicopters lifting off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was still fresh in everyone's minds. President Gerald Ford had just granted Richard Nixon a pardon that split the country in 2. Trust in institutions was fracturing. People were tired and suspicious and trying to figure out what came next. Into that world, Lindy Sue Bashler was building something small and good. She was 19, recently married to a 20-year-old man named Philip Bashler, and the 2 of them shared an apartment in the Spring Manor complex on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. She worked at a local floral shop. She had long hair and a gentle face, and the people who knew her would later reach for those exact words when asked to describe her. Gentle, kind, the kind of person you remember because of how she made you feel, not because she was chasing anything loud. That Friday afternoon, Lindy stopped at the bank on her way home. She deposited the couple's paycheck, then swung by the grocery store, came back to the apartment, and set the bags down on the dining table. She never opened them. Sometime between 6:45 and 900 that evening, a man entered that apartment and attacked her. What happened in that living room was not quick. It was not clean. Lindy Sue Bashler fought back with everything she had, her hands, her body, her refusal to give up. The evidence would later confirm it. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, signs of a sustained, violent struggle across the living room floor. She was not a passive victim. She fought. But the man had 2 knives. One he had brought with him. A second he grabbed from her own kitchen. She was stabbed 19 times in the neck, the chest, the abdomen, the back. When it was over, he left one of the knives embedded in her throat, and then he wrapped a dish towel around the handle. That detail is important. In the middle of a killing, 19 stab wounds, blood everywhere, a young woman dead on the floor, this man stopped and deliberately covered the knife handle with a towel. To destroy fingerprints, to protect himself. He was not someone acting in blind panic. He was someone thinking, calculating, someone who had enough control over his own mind even in that moment to think about getting away with it. Lindy's aunt and uncle arrived that evening to exchange a recipe. They knocked. They entered. They found her on her back on the living room floor, and what they saw in that apartment never left them for the rest of their lives. Police responded immediately. The crime scene told a clear story of sexual motivation and extraordinary violence. A man's footprint was found in the kitchen. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death and documented signs of sexual assault alongside the stab wounds. Investigators recognized right away that the timing of the attack, wedged tightly between Lindy's arrival home and Philip's expected return, was not accidental. This was not a random break-in. Whoever did this knew her routine, knew exactly when she would be alone. What followed was one of the most exhaustive investigations Lancaster County had ever mounted. Detectives formed a dedicated task force. They consulted criminologists from agencies outside the county. They revisited the crime scene multiple times, combing it for anything that might have been missed. And they interviewed people, 300 of them in total. Every friend, every coworker at the floral shop, every resident of the Spring Manor complex and the surrounding building. Philip Bashler was questioned and cleared, as procedure required. Every name that surfaced was run down, Every thread was pulled until it either broke or led nowhere. The killer had left no fingerprints. The footprint in the kitchen matched nothing and no one. And 300 conversations with 300 people produced not a single name worth looking at twice. There was, however, one thing the killer could not control. In the process of attacking Lindy, he had left biological material behind, specifically semen recovered from her underwear. In December of 1975, that sample had no investigative value. DNA profiling did not yet exist. There was nothing to do with it except store it, label it carefully, and wait. And so investigators did exactly that. They packaged the evidence, filed it away, and wrote a case number on the outside. Then they kept waiting. The investigation continued for years before hitting a permanent wall. The task force was eventually dissolved. The leads that had once seemed worth following were exhausted. Files were passed from one generation of investigators to the next, and with each handoff came the same reality: nothing. No new witness, no deathbed confession, no tip that pointed anywhere useful. 47 years is a long time to carry a question with no answer. Philip Bashler went home to an empty apartment in December of 1975 and never really left that night behind. He grew older. The world around him changed almost beyond recognition. And somewhere in the same county, on the same roads, in the same community, the man who killed his wife was also growing older. Unremarkable, unknown, living inside the silence that 300 interviews had never broken. The Lindy Sue Bashler case became the oldest unsolved homicide in the entire recorded history of Lancaster County. A title that meant something terrible, that a killer had simply won, had waited long enough, had outlasted every investigator who ever looked at that file, except nobody closed the file and nobody discarded the DNA. In April 2018, the arrest of a 72-year-old retired police officer in Sacramento, California, shook the entire world of cold case investigation. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man law enforcement had been calling the Golden State Killer for decades, had committed at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California during the 1970s and 80s. And he had been found not through a traditional DNA match, not through a confession, not through any method that had existed when his crimes were committed. He was caught through genetic genealogy. The concept sounds almost impossibly precise for something so personal. Take crime scene DNA, upload it to a public genealogy database, and search not for the suspect himself, but for his relatives, cousins, distant family members, anyone who shares enough genetic material to suggest a common ancestor. Then build out that family tree, branch by branch, generation by generation, until the branches converge on a name, then verify, then arrest. It had worked for the Golden State Killer. Investigators in Lancaster County took note. In 2020, the county's cold case unit reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that had become the leading name in forensic genetic genealogy. They connected with a scientist named C.C. Moore, Parabon's chief genetic genealogist, who had by that point helped crack hundreds of cases that had seemed completely unsolvable. Moore opened the Bashler file, and almost immediately, she recognized that this was nothing like any case she had worked before. In a typical genetic genealogy investigation, the crime scene DNA produces matches in public databases at the level of second or third cousins, people who share great-grandparents with the suspect. From there, you build a family tree and narrow it down. It's painstaking, but there's a framework. There's a starting point close enough to work with. In the Bashler case, the closest relatives that the DNA turned up in the entire public genealogy database were not third cousins. They were not fourth cousins. The shared ancestors between these distant matches and the unknown killer had lived in the 1600s and 1700s, 300 to 400 years ago. The genealogical distance was so vast that the standard playbook was useless. Moore later described this case as the hardest she had ever faced in her career, and rather than walking away from it, she did something that no one in the field had done before. She invented a new method. If the DNA matches all pointed back to people whose ancestors had lived centuries ago, people scattered across Pennsylvania, across other states, across the country, then the question became, where did those ancestors come from originally? What was the single geographic origin point that connected all of these distant relatives? The answer, after months of meticulous work that stretched across multiple researchers and thousands of genealogical records, was a village called Gasparina, a small settlement in Calabria, the toe of Italy's boot in the country's deep south. Every one of the DNA matches in the public database, regardless of where they lived now, traced their ancestry back to families from that same village. Gasparina. Population, a few thousand. A place most Americans had never heard of. From that discovery, Moore's team began working forward through time. Which families from Gasparina had emigrated to the United States? Which of those had settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania? Cross-referencing genealogical records with immigration histories, and narrowing by age and sex, the suspect was male, and based on the 1975 crime, almost certainly born in the late 1940s or 1950s, the list of possible individuals began to shrink. One name kept sitting at the top: David Sinopoli, 68 years old, residing in East Hempfield Township, Lancaster County. No criminal record of any kind. No previous contact with law enforcement. Not a single mention in 47 years of investigative files. And then came the detail that made the room go quiet. In December of 1975, David Sinopoli had lived in the Spring Manor apartment complex on Kloss Drive, the same 4-unit building as Lindy and Philip Bashler. He had been a neighbor. His door had been steps from hers. She may have seen his face in the hallway 100 times and thought nothing of it. Investigators now had a name. What they did not have, not yet, was proof. Genetic genealogy can identify a suspect, but it cannot convict one. To bring this case into a courtroom, they needed a DNA sample directly from David Sinopoli that could be compared against the crime scene evidence. And they couldn't simply ask for one. A direct approach would tip him off and shatter any element of surprise. A court order required more evidence than they currently had. So they waited, quietly, patiently. Investigators established surveillance on Sinopoli without his knowledge, tracking his daily movements, noting his habits, watching for the moment he would do something entirely ordinary, something anyone might do, something that would leave his DNA behind. That moment came on February 11, 2022. David Sinopoli flew into Philadelphia International Airport. At some point during his time there, he bought a coffee. He drank it. He walked to a trash can and threw the cup away. Investigators were watching. They moved immediately, retrieved the cup before it could be lost among ordinary garbage, and sent it to the laboratory. The results came back. The DNA extracted from the rim of that discarded coffee cup matched the semen collected from Lindy Sue Bashler's underwear in December 1975 with a probability ratio of approximately 1 in 10 trillion. The result was further confirmed against blood evidence from the same clothing. There was not a rounding error here, not a marginal correlation, not a statistical suggestion. This was a match so complete that it eliminated every other human being on Earth as the source. David Sinopoli had thrown away his alibi without knowing it. On July 17, 2022, Lancaster County investigators drove to David Sinopoli's home in East Hempfield Township and arrested him. The date marked 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days since Lindy Bashler's murder. He was taken into custody without incident. The man who had spent nearly half a century living freely among the people of Lancaster County was handcuffed and processed and placed in a cell. The next morning, District Attorney Heather Adams stood at a podium in front of cameras and reporters and said the words that Philip Bashler and Lindy's family had been waiting their entire adult lives to hear. The oldest cold case in Lancaster County history had been solved. Adams did not overstate the role of technology in a moment that deserved to be credited honestly. "To be frank," she said, "without those advances in DNA science, I'm not sure we ever would have gotten here." Sinopoli spent more than a year in pre-trial detention before making a decision that perhaps reflected what the DNA had already told the world. On October 19, 2023, he entered a Lancaster County courtroom before Judge David Ashworth and pleaded guilty to 3 charges: third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. No trial, no jury, no cross-examination of witnesses. Just a man standing before a judge and saying, yes. The courtroom was not a neutral space that day. Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson had arranged for a photograph of Lindy Sue Bashler to be placed directly beside the seat where Sinopoli would sit. He would have to exist in proximity to her face for the entire proceeding. When Wilson addressed him directly, she pointed at the photograph and said words that cut through the formality of the room. "These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten. While the defendant was able to continue living his life, Lindy was cut short by him. Look at her and the precious life you stole in 1975. Sinopoli looked at the photograph. His face did not change. There was no tremor of recognition, no grief, no visible weight of 47 years finally coming due. Nothing. Judge Ashworth spoke plainly about what he saw in front of him. The harm caused was incomprehensible, he said. The moral depravity of the crime could not be overstated. And critically, he noted that this guilty plea had not come from remorse or conscience. It had come because a coffee cup had made it inescapable. Philip Bashler stood and addressed the man who had ended his first marriage before it had really begun. His words did not rage. They stated something heavier than anger, the plain arithmetic of what had been taken. "You took a huge part of my life and caused immeasurable suffering to so many people," he said. "While others have had to live with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life." When Judge Ashworth gave Sinopoli the floor to speak, he offered 11 words. "I want to apologize to everyone, including my wife." Not a single word about December 5, 1975. Not a single word about why he had walked into that apartment. Not an explanation for the 19 stab wounds, or the dish towel wrapped around the knife handle, or the 57 years he spent letting Lindy Bashler's family wonder. The only question that mattered, why, was the one question he did not answer. And it may never be answered now. Judge Ashworth sentenced Sinopoli to 25 to 50 years in prison under the sentencing guidelines in effect in 1975, the era when the crime occurred. At age 69, that sentence was indistinguishable from a life sentence. David Sinopoli would die in prison. He would not walk out. He would not grow old in the same community where his neighbor's family grew old without her. He was also ordered to pay $25,210 in prosecution costs, a number almost absurdly small next to what had actually been taken. The Lindy Sue Bashler case did not produce a law in her name. It did not launch a foundation or inspire a documentary series or end with a press conference where everyone agreed justice had been neatly restored. It ended the way most real cases end, with something that looked like resolution from the outside and felt far more complicated from the inside. But within the specific technical world of forensic genetic genealogy, this case occupies a position no other solved case holds. It was the hardest. By a significant margin, it was the hardest. Every other case solved through genetic genealogy had started with DNA matches at a workable genealogical distance, matches that gave investigators a foothold, a nearby branch of the family tree to climb. The Bashler case gave C.C. Moore matches from the 1600s and nothing closer. The standard method did not apply. There was no existing playbook. And rather than closing the file, Moore built a new method from scratch, tracing forward from a 17th-century Italian village to a specific man living in a Pennsylvania township in 2022. That method is now a tool. Other investigators working on other cold cases, cases where the DNA matches are too distant for conventional genetic genealogy, now have a framework they can apply because C.C. Moore had to invent it for Lindy Bashler. The legacy of this case, in practical terms, is that it extended the reach of justice into corners where it previously could not go. That is not a small thing. There is a lesson in the operational details of this case, a lesson that matters for anyone living in a shared building, a quiet neighborhood, a place that feels safe because it always has. The man who killed Lindy Sue Bashler was not a stranger who wandered in. He lived in the same building. He likely passed her in the hallway. He knew when her husband would be home because he was close enough to know her routine. The most dangerous person is not always the one who feels dangerous. Sometimes it is the one who feels like nothing at all. A neighbor, a familiar face, someone you've nodded to 100 times without a second thought. Lock your door. Know your neighbor only as well as they have given you reason to trust them. Tell someone where you are and when you'll be back. Trust the instinct that tightens in your chest without announcing a reason for being there. And know this, DNA does not have a statute of limitations. It does not lose patience or retire or accept a settlement. A coffee cup thrown into an airport trash can in 2022 reached back 47 years and made a killer accountable. The evidence preserved in 1975, when no one had any way of knowing what it would eventually do, was the thread that tied David Sinopoli to the living room of an apartment where a 19-year-old woman fought for her life and lost. She was not forgotten. The file was never closed. The sample was never discarded. And 47 years later, a scientist traced a bloodline across an ocean to a village in southern Italy and followed it forward through centuries of migration and settlement until the name at the end of that line was the man who had been living in Lancaster County all along. Lindy Sue Bashler deserved better than what happened to her on December 5, 1975. She deserved the life she was building, the floral shop, the young marriage, the grocery bags on the dining table waiting to be unpacked. She did not get it, but she got something else. A case that refused to go cold all the way. Investigators who preserved one fragile piece of evidence through generations. A scientist who refused to accept that the distance was too great. And finally, a courtroom where a photograph of her face sat beside the man who stole everything from her. That is not justice restored. Justice restored would mean she gets to live her life. But it is the closest thing to an answer that the law can provide. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about safety, about persistence, about what science can now reach back and reclaim, share it, subscribe. Because every person who watches is someone else who carries forward the names that deserve to be remembered.